you like the darkest, most macabre romantic movies? Well, you might like Born Dead, which is originally known in its Italian name as Morti. Now, this is an Italian movie and is a bizarre, weird, macabre love story in many ways. It focuses on this woman called Luna, who, let's just say she's had a troubled past, and she is obsessed with death. She kind of works as a taxidermist. She goes out in the forest, collects kind of dead animals, you know, stuffs them and kind of sells them. But she is really genuinely obsessed with death and all things related to death. And she happens one day whilst she is walking in the forest to find two bodies. Now, one of them is a woman who has been murdered, and the other one is a guy who has done the murdering, who's been mortally wounded but not dead. Now, she decides that she's going to take both bodies, well, both kind of like, you know, one the dead body, one a kind of a barely alive body, back to her place of residence and where she works as also, and nurse the kind of this guy back to some type of health. Not completely, but, you know, essentially get him on the road to recovery. And we learn that this guy is a kind of serial killer. And initially the relationship is quite hostile, but it ends up blossoming, you might say, into the darkest of romances. And from there, the two of them seem like kindred spirits. We've got a guy who wants to kind of go and kill people. That's his kind of urge. He's essentially a rapist, a serial killer. And this woman who really sees him as a kind of a muse for her art and this kind of inspiration for her creativity, and is obsessed with death, and in particular this guy who brings death. Now, what will happen from there? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss what I think works for this movie. So this one isn't going to be for everyone. Let's just kind of say that. However, I found this movie hauntingly alluring. It's weird. It's not the sort of film I would genuinely kind of watch, but I was kind of somewhat transfixed by it. And I think this is partly down to its production. It's a very slow-moving story. There isn't much in regards to plot. The plot is relatively slight, but it's more about these strange characters who are both severely off-kilter, you might say, and their slow kind of like changing of relationships, coupled with some interesting cinematography, some very kind of effective music, what I think kind of, you know, gives you this kind of sadness, this kind of dark love story, so to speak. And, you know, I gotta be honest with you, I kind of, you know, you felt this kind of connection, albeit it's a perverse kind of like macabre connection, but nonetheless, I do feel the movie actually makes you as an audience member kind of go along with that story. And when you're talking about, you know, a guy, your protagonist, one of which is a rapist and serial killer, the other which who is like a strange woman who is essentially obsessed with death, you know, it's fair play for a movie to kind of get you to be interested in these characters' plight. Now, we have a couple of other characters that kind of pop up through the movie, you know, and add a little bit more kind of gore. And let's talk about that gore, because this movie is quite explicit. Now, I suspect what they've used is animal kind of bits, basically. But there is some realistic looking gore here, and I suspect it is using kind of close-ups of kind of animal carcasses to kind of cut with, to kind of give it this somewhat of a realistic effect. But we don't really see much in the way of kind of like wide-angle shots to kind of, you know, where we see a human figure being kind of like ripped apart. There is a couple, but they are clearly, obviously, just you know, prosthetics and stuff. But the gory shots here tend to be kind of tight angles and probably cutting open like a pig or something. But it might be too much for some. But the other thing is as well this movie does do is it kind of goes into some pretty explicit territory. For example, you know, we have a scene where essentially this guy, Tony, is disposing of a body that he has killed. And he's chopping it up, and the woman's getting turned on by it, and is literally picking up this woman's intestines and masturbating with them. Yes, that's a scene in the movie. So it's kind of like pretty explicit. I mean, you know, it's not a porn. You don't necessarily see much in the way of genitalia. There's a little bit, but you know, it's obviously the what it's kind of implying, but pretty explicitly, you know. So yeah, this movie is definitely somewhat of an interesting watch. But I gotta be honest, I thought the characters were intriguing. Now, the version I've watched was a dubbed version. It was a screener, so there was no other option for it. And the dubbing wasn't brilliant, so the acting did seem a little bit kind of hokey. But I understood that this was a dubbed version, so I didn't necessarily let that bother me too much, because it kind of gives it that strange Euro charm as well. I mean, the Italians are well known for their kind of like history in gore and horror. So this kind of just, I don't know, it added to that kind of, that retro feel to a certain degree, despite this being, you know, a modern movie. You know, having these kind of like, these kind of dubbed and somewhat kind of like hanky kind of like translations. I don't know, it just added to the kind of like the weird sort of ambience that this movie was kind of like giving out there. So I actually thought it kind of quite fit within that film. The movie's relatively kind of short. And I've got to say, I kind of liked, in the regards to the story, how it ended. Because it was kind of like, I can't get in the way, but it was fitting for the film. Let me just kind of say that. So let's talk about what I think doesn't work. Clearly this is going to be a taste issue for some. Some people aren't going to like this because of the subject matter. Yes, there's kind of necrophiliac kind of things going on here. You know, it's kind of like pretty extreme for some. But that's not really a criticism of the film. That's more of a, you know, a taste issue, whether you're going to like it or not. So let's kind of move past that and look at actual criticisms I have. So, I mean, the movie's plot is slight, but I don't think the movie's necessarily going for a complex kind of narrative. It's more of a, you know, a character piece in many ways, showing you this kind of how these kind of characters at the fringes of society are kind of drawn together over this kind of the subject of death, but coming at it from kind of different kind of places. But there isn't much in the regard story. So if you're wanting a complex story, if you're wanting action set pieces, if you're wanting kind of like, you know, high impact kills, you aren't going to find it in this movie. So, you know, some people might find it a little dull, to be honest. It is low budget. One thing that did bother me in this movie, I like some of the creative choices. I like the choice of music, some of the cinematography, some of the washed out colours that we had here that gives it this kind of sepia kind of vibe in certain sequences. But one thing I didn't like was the insistence to use shaky cam in some sequences, which I found quite distracting. This is obviously an artistic choice, because it's not like it's on an action scene or anything, when they're typically used to kind of make an action scene seem kind of more kinetic and things like that. But here it's just like wobbling around to try and, oh my god, it's something weird happening, it's something kind of freaky happening, so we'll kind of shake the camera. And, you know, it was a little distracting, to be honest with you. So there's that on a kind of a technical level. Some of the kind of the, you know, when we see the use of kind of like, what I'm assuming is kind of like animal corpses and stuff, yeah, the gore looks kind of you know, kind of realistic. But there's also one or two instances where kind of, I think, the use of prosthetics is clearly at a lower budget. The acting, hard to judge, because like I said, I watched this as a dubbed version, so it's kind of hard to judge, but you know, just on the surface level, if you don't look past that, it's going to seem hokey, because obviously, I mean, I don't know what the actual Italian language version was like, but certainly if you're watching the dubbed version and you're not appreciating the kind of the old school feeling that this may give it. It kind of comes across as hokey, and the translations and what is said seems kind of dumb. And you know, I think maybe, you know, you could poke holes in regards to there's never any kind of police and things like this, and you know, no one seems to be kind of going looking for kind of missing people, stuff like that. So there's a few kind of elements here that you could probably kind of like sort of poke holes into a certain degree. But I don't think that movie is necessarily, like I've said, too worried about telling you a narrative, and it's more about kind of like a journey with the characters. So how to kind of rate this movie? I can't honestly say it's a good movie in some ways, because it's kind of, there's not a lot to it really. It's certainly going to be a taste issue for some, and there are some kind of limitations in regards to budget or technical ability and things like that. So I can't necessarily say this is a you know, a good, you know, a great movie that you've got to watch. But there's something about it. If you can accept that I mean, I watch a lot of horror movies on the channel, so things like this doesn't really, you know, it doesn't really bother me like it might some, but it is clearly not like a movie like a Serbian film, for example, where it's kind of going for pure shock value. It's meant to be shocking, but at the same time, it's meant to take you on this kind of like, this dark emotional journey. I gotta be honest with you, I actually think it succeeded, and I was, even though this is no film I would typically kind of watch had it not been sent as a screener to me, I gotta be honest with you, I was, you know, I found it very engaging. I found the characters very engaging, and their bizarre kind of relationship. You know, it's one of those things where, you know, if you saw a car crash and you know, you can appreciate that that's a horrible thing, but you can't help but look. It's kind of like that. You know, I found it an engaging, dark, macabre love story, and I was quite intrigued by it. I'll give it a 6 out of 10, but I gotta be honest with you, this one ain't for everyone. So if you like things dark and spooky and a little bit kind of out there, a little bit kind of gross, you may want to check it out. So 6 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.